Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. First, we will discuss last week's European Council meeting and Biden's farewell trip to Germany. Then we will turn to a really interesting conversation with Mujtaba Rahman from Eurasia Group. He's back on the show to discuss the priorities and challenges facing the new European Commission and the current, rather dismal state of French politics. We hope you enjoy the show.
Max, let's start with last week's one-day European Council meeting. I'm saying one day because we've often seen them be 2 days, but I think the theme here might have been there's a lot to cover, but not a lot to say about it.
Yeah.
And it seems like that's what came out of Brussels. What's your take on it?
Well, it seemed like the major focus of the meeting was about migration. There's a great photo with von der Leyen, Meloni, and then a small subset of European leaders kind of discussing what they're going to talk about the European Council summit before the summit. Interestingly enough, the president of the European Council, Charles Michel, not in the photo. And I guess what sort of strikes me is the focus on migration. And there's been a lot of steps taken by numerous leaders. So starting, I think, in Germany last month, we sort of talked about this with spot border checks being put in place by the Olaf Scholz government. Donald Tusk recently came into this summit expressing real concern about refugee flows from Belarus, basically the weaponization of migration, and saying they were going to stop that. And so migration is sort of animating everything. But it's a little bit of a head scratcher for me. If you look at the numbers, you would think that if you listen to the politics, you would think that we're back in kind of a 2015 migration wave where people are just, showing up at train stations all across the continent. But we're not. I mean, the numbers are high. I think in 2023, fewer than 300,000 people made it to the continent. This year, the EU's border agency Frontex estimates about 160,000 migrants reaching Europe. And if you compare that to 2015, we were in the millions. And, Europe kind of has some labor issues. There's issues in Greece of, we actually need workers to pick the olives and stuff. And so, Europe, I think, is rather confused. We have an aging continent that is in some ways desperate for labor. And you look at America's sort of good economic performance, some of it is down to high levels of migration. And so we kind of have the economic demand and the social cultural demand really running up against each other here.
Yeah, migration is just one of those issues where the politics do not align with the policy needs at all. And that's what we're seeing in Europe. Obviously, this panic wind through the council comes on the heels of a lot of elections at the national level, where far-right parties are on the rise again, partly on the back of an anti-immigration message. And I think a lot of the center-left and center-right leaders in the council are looking at this thinking, oh no, I'm next. Tusk obviously is thinking about that next year for the presidential election in Poland because the current president, Duda, has blocked a lot of the things he's trying to pass. And the legitimacy of this current government in Poland rests on Tusk's ability to actually do things at the national level, to prove to people that it was the right thing to get law and justice out of power. So he's really worried that their presidential candidate might not make it, and that'll just continue the stalemate. He's not the only one. Obviously, there are other leaders that just have taken up this harsher migration message. But as you said, the arrivals are not near the highest levels we've seen. That's not to say that immigration and integration is an easy thing to do. It's not. There's also not a balanced appropriation or a balanced allocation, let's say, of asylum seekers and refugees across the bloc. Obviously, a lot of people who come in want to go to centers of economic power. They want to go to Germany. They want to get to France, possibly on their way to the UK. So it's not like they're spread out across the bloc, which is creating problems, obviously, because nobody wants to agree to a quota, which was the whole debate in 2015, 2016. But there's also, to me, it seems like very little appetite to actually implement the Migration Pact, which has already been approved and is supposed to come into force in 2026. And this summit felt like, oh, we'll just let's nobody mention this because some people disagree, some people want to implement it, so we're just stay back, reiterate the same things. Well, the conclusions say we'll revert to the matter. That means it's just going to keep being an issue that is stuck between all of these political dynamics.
Yeah, maybe a couple thoughts. One, I mean, this is sort of a classic case of the issues and challenges that come with European integration, and I think. What it demonstrates is that what Europe does is it integrated, creating a single market, reducing borders between countries. Great thing. You can now travel all across Europe. But then you kind of need to have a common migration policy. They've started to create a common border service with Frontex. But you kind of need to have a common approach to how you're treating people that are immigrants, because they can travel all across Europe once they're in, and where refugees and other people that are resettling can live. And so the only solution here really is a European solution. And that's where there has not been, I would say, a lot of comity between various European countries, Hungary in particular, where there needs to be, each country needs to be willing to accept certain number of people coming in. Shouldn't all be on Southern European countries. In some ways, it mirrors a bit the debate in the United States. But to me, the second thing is, why are we talking about this, right? This is the first European Council summit meeting. And literally in the news, there are reports that the North Koreans are providing, there's 10,000 North Korean soldiers that are being trained by the Russians that are going to be deployed to the front. Ukraine is really on the back foot. There are major problems in European defense production, that there has not been the money allocated to really ramp up defense production for the longer term, that there is a war in Europe. And we are about to have an American election that may or may not determine the future of U.S. support, or will determine the future of U.S. support. One in a clear direction, and one it will determine it in a clear direction. Either we'll pull back funding or we'll continue funding. But there is an urgent need for Europe to figure out how to finance a longer-term war effort for Ukraine. And that is just not happening. And instead, we're, at the EU level, there's focusing on issues that are important. Migration is important. It's animating European politics. European politicians want to look active here. But there is, a really urgent situation going on in Ukraine. And there has been very little senior level European focus on this war. And it seems like everyone's just biding their time to wait to see what the Americans do. But if Donald Trump is elected, then the time for Europe to have acted was actually 2 years ago, because that's how long it takes to ramp up defense industrial production. So I think this was in some ways a really irresponsible European Council summit, to say the least. And maybe this transitions into Biden's farewell trip to Germany, which I'm also here is the country in Berlin that is and has been the obstacle to a lot of pan-European efforts to support Ukraine, ramp up defense industrial production. And there are signs that the ability for Germany to support Ukraine the way it has been is looking short. But so what happened with Biden's trip to Germany?
So, yeah. Some journalists at Political Europe talked about the council to say this is a story about nothing. Basically, nothing happened. They talked about migration a lot. They talked about other things, and in defense, Ukraine is very prominent in the council conclusions. But once again, we get the feeling it's Fortress Europe, and there's not a lot of foresight for what comes later. But Biden met. He was there to receive high honor from Germany for his contributions to transatlantic relations, for his vision, which I think is accurate. Right. I mean, the work that he has done, first and foremost on Ukraine, to make sure that all allies worked together is not negligible by any means. He was also there to meet with France, Germany, and the UK to talk about Ukraine. There's some complaints in Germany from the CDU, for example, that Poland was not invited, and they're actually a pretty big contributor to NATO, but also have been incredibly forward-leaning on supporting Ukraine, making sure they have what they need. They have a lot of Ukrainian refugees in Poland, so it was a good. I think it's a good mission. It's a good thing for Biden to go to Europe as kind of a farewell tour because he is a dedicated Atlanticist. He was also there. They talked about Ukraine and the Middle East, and I think he probably finds sympathetic ears in Berlin about the relationship with Israel, et cetera, more than he would in Paris or in Madrid or, other places across the bloc, or, for example, in Italy right now. But you see this and you just think, I don't know, I feel like it's two leaders who are in a very sputtering situation who haven't been able to get their coalitions to move to do a lot in the last few months. Obviously, Joe Biden is because he's on his way out, but it feels like a state visit to see some friends. I don't know that he tried that much to push on things like Ukraine, on German defense, which maybe he didn't want to, but I'm curious for your take.
No, look, I think no one can begrudge President Biden for going to Germany and sort of highlighting what his administration has done for NATO and the alliance, which I think has been a lot and really a real sea change from where the Trump administration was. And I think it's pretty clear that there's a close relationship with Scholz. I do think it was an own goal to not have Poland at the Quad meeting. Now, the Quad is sort of a pre-existing entity, I guess, where the U.S., U.K., France, and Germany meet. But where we are right now is Poland needs to be there, in part because France and Germany are politically a mess. France has a really high budget deficit, as we'll talk about in the interview. Germany has this, insane constitutional court that we've talked about. And it also has this insane black zero where it can't have a budget deficit. So right now, European support for Ukraine is really stuck, and that's where Poland is really important. Now, Poland is spending a ton on its military, but where we aren't is really that money. A lot of that money is not really matriculating to Ukraine because Poland is focused on defending itself if it must. And where we need to get to is some collective European way to support Ukraine. And I say collective because I just don't see how individual member states can continue to support Ukraine the way they have been. And that's a real problem. In some ways, the United States allows Germany to play it. That Germany is very quick at sort of bending, dropping to the floor and bowing down to the NATO alliance and to U.S. strength, and that no way that European security can be upheld without the United States. And they're right, but they're right in part because of European fecklessness. And so Germany sort of does that and then goes to Brussels and says, no way, we can't do any of these things.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And we need to, I think, begin to be a little bit, not tougher is not the right word, but to recognize what Germany's doing and to sort of begin to outline a new strategy for where we need to go.
Of course, I'd be curious to be a fly on the wall in the behind the closed door conversation that Biden could have had with Scholz about this. It just doesn't strike me as a situation where he would want to really put his foot down, even though we know, as you said, Germany responds best to calls from the United States, not so much to calls from its allies in Brussels. So the levers really belong here in Washington, and I'm not sure this trip was meant to...
To be fair, I think it might be a little too late in both of their tenures, both in President Biden having just a few months left, but also where the current Scholz government is really on the precipice, and whether it'll continue for another year, I think, remains an open question. And with that, I think that's a good segue to our conversation with Midge Rahman. We are thrilled to welcome Midge Rahman back to the Eurofile. Midge is Managing Director for Europe at Eurasia Group, where he oversees the firm's analysis and advisory work on the continent. Prior to joining Eurasia Group, Mujtaba worked at the European Commission's Directorate General for Economic and Financial Affairs in the UK Treasury, and he is one of the main go-to sources for all things, not just what's happening inside of Brussels and the EU, but also inside of France, and also inside of what's happening in the UK. Midge, thanks so much for coming back on the Eurofile.
Thanks for having me.
So maybe we could start by sort of drilling into this new European Commission. There's a European Council summit that is happening this week when we're recording. But I'm very curious for kind of your overall take on how you see this sort of new commission lining up, the new cast of characters that are becoming heads of various departments. How do you see the EU sort of postured as it enters a new 5-year administration?
So I think it's the von der Leyen show. I think she used the opportunity of reshuffling her team to consolidate her power. And she has done that by placing loyalists in the key substantive portfolios. And here I'm thinking primarily of Vladis Dombrovskis, who will oversee economy and financial affairs, Maros Sefcovic, that will be responsible for trade in China, as well as the reset with the UK, and Piotr Serafan, who is a former head of cabinet to Donald Tusk when he was European Council president, Poland's ambassador to the EU, who will now run the European Commission's department on the budget. They're the three principals that are managing really key aspects of policy that are going to be really important in the context of the next mandate. And they're all close to von der Leyen. They have good relationship with her, a good effective working relationship with her. And I suspect, they'll be incredibly important. There are others in the commission that have been elevated and given these grandiose titles, EVPs, executive vice presidents. Maloney has an ally in the form of Fito, who will be responsible for cohesion policy, and obviously Stéphane Séjourné, Macron's appointee, who will be responsible for industrial policy. But these EVPs, I think it's more symbolic than substantive, and that's what's interesting. The folks that are the EVPs are not really the folks that are running the policies that I think are going to be the most important in the context of the next mandate. And Séjourné is a good example of that. There's an awkward division of labor on certain aspects of policy between him and Sefcovic. Fito's doing cohesion, but not really the recovery and resilience facility or the fiscal framework. That's Dombrovskis. And Serafan is doing all the financial budget related stuff that's going to undergird a lot of what von der Leyen does in the context of her next term. And so the general point to make is her allies have been empowered. There are a lot of overlapping responsibilities, which will create turf wars. And those turf wars will ultimately only be resolvable by von der Leyen and her head of cabinet, Bjorn Siebert. And so that, of course, consolidates and reinforces her agency and power within the institutions in Brussels.
We've covered previously on the Eurofile the slaying of Thierry Breton, which I think in some ways was a peak power move by von der Leyen and removing him from the commission. But I guess the larger question is, what is this commission, do you think, going to be about? September started with the rollout of the Draghi report. There's a new defense commissioner. There's, I think, some degree of uncertainty about what the future of the Green Deal is and European climate policy with kind of the EPP, and I think many on the right, sort of increasingly angsty or in opposition to kind of doubling down on some of the EU's climate agenda. We've obviously had conversations about EV tariffs already at the EU over the last month. What are the animating issues that are going to take place? And I think if you were to sort of maybe project forward 5 years, what do you think this commission will be known for? What is it trying to be known for over the next 5 years?
The really fundamental major element of policy that VDR will need to deliver in the next mandate, and it's key to everything she wants to do, is going to be a major reform and overhaul of the EU budget, how it organizes its finances. So how does it organize its finances? Where does that money come from? Is it capital markets? Is it direct contributions from member states? Is it through new own resources? How is that money dispersed? On what basis is it dispersed? And what purposes is that financing used for? Is it agricultural subsidies, cohesion? Is it other stuff? This is really key. So this is basically the architecture around how Europe organizes its finances and where it decides to put its money. That's important because the Commission will initiate a proposal on that either in June or September next year. And that will underpin everything. It underpins the response to Draghi and whether Europe can deliver the 800 billion fiscal gap or investment gap per year that Draghi is talking about. It's key to what von der Leyen will need and want to do in Ukraine, assuming that we are moving to diplomacy, negotiations, and some form of, land for peace deal and ceasefire. That will involve, I think, economic support from the European Union. How will that financing be put in place? It's going to be key to what we do, what Europe does for treaty security and defence, and how Europe looks after its own security and defence in light of, I think, the general expectation that the trend from America is withdrawal. It will be more abrupt under Trump, more gradual under Harris, but the direction of travel is the same. So really the response across all of those major policy areas, competitiveness, security, Ukraine, is a function of money. And that, Matt, better than anyone, because I see you writing and tweeting about it all the time. And so the reform of the budget is a major area of policy. There is a debate in Brussels among folks close to von der Leyen about how ambitious they want to be and how ambitious they think they can be, given it operates on the basis of unanimity. But that's going to be really important. And then the other areas of policy are the ones I've talked about. So Ukraine, and where the hell is Europe, not just in terms of agency and representation, but its actual policy position on, any peace agreement and ceasefire. Where are the member states and how aligned are they and can they be? Competitiveness will be a major theme, as we've talked about, and security and defence, for the reasons we've talked about. So I think they're the major areas of policy. I don't think enlargement will feature. I think enlargement will chug along, but I don't think it's a priority. And actually, in all the conversations I have, people are de-emphasizing the extent to which enlargement will play a role in the Ukraine solution, or more generally over the course of the next 5 years. We could talk about that if that's of interest.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about the importance of the budget overhaul, because also now it makes a lot of sense why Serafin will be such an important player in this. Just briefly for our listeners as well, the Italian EVP is Raffaele Fitto. I'm curious what your sense is for this proposal coming from the Commission, because von der Leyen has centralized so much power and probably feels like she might have some leeway. This thing we're going to see next year about the overhaul of the budget, is it your sense that she might push for a proposal that includes treaty changes? And do we need treaty changes? Or is she going to focus on what she can do within the Commission she has now?
So I'm sure she will not look for treaty changes, almost certain. And that's because of the reality that you're seeing across the member states, not least in France. I mean, we'll probably be in early election territory in France come next June, July. Assuming Barnier gets the budget through Parliament by the end of this year, there is an open question about whether the government can last much longer than the end or the turn of the year. And so I can't imagine the French will welcome the idea of a referendum in order to ultimately transfer more resources to Brussels. I mean, you can't sell that argument to anyone in France, and no one in France is willing to make that argument because they don't want to give more money to Brussels. France is a frugal member state now, given it's got a 6% deficit, and they need to get that under control, kind of very quickly. So I don't think she will target treaty change, but I think you can still do a tremendous amount in the absence of treaty change if you get the agreement of the European Council. So the first question I think to ask is, how ambitious will the Commission be in its initial articulation of what it's trying to do for the next MFF, the next EU budget? And then the second, of course, question will be, do the member states pick up that ambition and support it or not? So it's a 2 or 3 level game. And I think in the first instance, the thing to figure out is von der Leyen, her head of cabinet, the head of DG budget, Stephanie Rizzo, people like Piotr Serafin, 4 or 5 officials are going to be really key in crafting the Commission's initial pitch. Where does that land in terms of how the money will be raised, where it will be spent, whether it's linked to reforms or not, et cetera, et cetera. And then it will have to get digested and picked up by the European Council. But if she starts by talking about treaty change, I think she'll lose the argument before she's even got her foot out of the door. So I don't suspect that's what von der Leyen will do.
There's definitely not a lot of appetite for that anywhere, and increasingly less so with all the elections we're seeing across the bloc. And that's what comes to mind for my next question, which is, we're recording this on the day of the European Council summit in Brussels, and the agenda is quite large. They want to talk about Ukraine, the Middle East, migration, etc. But from where we're sitting, it looks like it's mostly going to be about migration. Do you feel like von der Leyen and the rest of the institutions might try to build some goodwill with those European leaders on a stricter migration regime, stronger implementation period of the migration pact, and hope that they can leverage that into political capital for these budget changes? Or that's unlikely to help her build anything?
Look, I think migration is a major problem because it is, without doubt, the issue, kind of the first issue among equals that is driving the performance of the far right at the national and at the European level. I think that's absolutely the case in Germany. It's the case in France. It's the case in Austria. It will probably be the case in the Czech Republic. It was absolutely the case in the context of the European elections on the 6th to 9th of February this year, albeit the centre largely held. You still had the far right performing incredibly well, and they've obviously now organized in the image of Orban in the context of this new group, the Patriots for Europe. So migration is a major challenge and a major problem at both the national and the European level. And for that reason, I suspect von der Leyen is going to have to do something to address these concerns. The major reform to the EU's asylum system that was agreed, I believe, late last year, early this year, didn't address two structural problems, which is repatriation deals. How do you negotiate repatriation agreements with third countries that don't have governments? Major constraint. And so, yes, we do have an agreement with Egypt, Tunisia, with Albania, but, how can you implement deals with other countries that don't have functional regimes? That's a major constraint. And then the second problem the reform did not address was internal redistribution of migrants that land in the EU, where there is a quota system and there's still major disagreement among capitals about how that works and whether it works well. So unless and until those two structural issues are addressed, you're going to continue to see countries fighting. You're going to see lumpy implementation, and we're going to see this remain a major problem. I think there is a general point to make here about the three major areas where Europe is now struggling are the three major areas that are the least susceptible to integration because they define what it means to be a nation state: migration, security and defense, and fiscal policy. And they're the three areas that we're talking about. They're the three areas that, where countries typically really guard their national sovereignty. And you get agreement at the European level on migration that's meaningful and prevents this being an issue that's exploited by populist parties, I'm skeptical. But I think von der Leyen will have to try. Even if she does try and you move to a regime that is more effective at the European level, I don't think she will build any equity or credibility that will travel into the budget negotiations. Budget negotiations are very zero sum, right? What one country gains, another country loses. Going back to national parliaments and asking for more contributions to Europe is not easy in a context where Germany's still having to cut 16 to 20 billion from the budget next year. And, Macron is implementing a correction of 1.5% of GDP, of which, 0.9% is increase in taxes and the rest is spending cut. How do you make an argument to your populations in that context that we need more money for the EU? It's very, very hard. So I think the budget negotiations will be difficult. They'll be difficult enough, and I don't think a win on migration will make them necessarily any easier.
Let me ask you, Etienne and I are sitting here in Washington. We have an election in a few weeks. And in some ways, when I think about the U.S.-EU relations under the Biden administration, it has struck me that we've come a long way, and that the relationship in particular between President Biden and President von der Leyen has been incredibly strong. A former senior U.S. official once described it to me as that we now have an answer to the Kissinger question, that we know who to call when we're trying to call Europe, and we call von der Leyen or Bjorn Sivert. I'm curious how it's sort of seen, perhaps from Brussels, the U.S. role in many of these European debates. Is there a U.S. role? Can the U.S. play a role? Is it even conceived of? And I guess how you sort of see America's potential role. I mean, under Trump, it'll be very different, but under Harris, is there sort of a desire for a degree of continuity for the U.S. to do some things differently than it's been doing under the Biden administration?
Yeah, it's a great question, Max. And it's a bit odd in a way, because I think, Trump is feared by all capitals, maybe barring the Hungarians. I think there is a general concern about what a Trump administration would mean for transatlantic relations, obviously on trade, if he implements a 60% tariff against the Chinese and 10% on the rest of the world. That could result in huge dumping on the European market. What would the EU response be? Concerns about NATO and potential withdrawal, concerns about imposition of a top-down peace on Ukraine, concerns that he will provide inspiration to far-right parties all over the EU. And yet, it's actually only under a Trump scenario that I think you see a silver lining for Europe, where he does do something existential like withdrawal from NATO, and that galvanizes von der Leyen's ability to cajole capitals to deliver the quantum leap on integration. I was in Brussels 2 weeks ago, and every single member state ambassador I spoke to was clear that the definition of an existential crisis was Trump's withdrawal from NATO, that would be the kind of political stress test necessary to shock the politics in Germany and France and elsewhere out of the malaise and the complacency and the inward domestic focus that they currently have, to do more at the European level. You know, that's where you get your 1 to 200 billion euro bond for defense, and you get it before the German election, and you get it before the next MFF. And we are doing interesting things at the European level, strategic autonomy. Many countries won't like it being described in that way, but effectively giving real teeth to that agenda and moving it forward short term, I think only happens under a Trump scenario, under a worst case scenario. And so long term, you know, Europe is doing more for itself and is more coherent and more secure only in the worst case scenario. I think under Harris, there'll be huge complacency. And yes, you don't get the shock of Trump, but then you also don't get the integration. What you effectively get is von der Leyen attempting to execute her agenda in light of very meaningful headwinds from national capitals that I don't think she'll be able to overcome. And so you're in a much messier, ultimately longer term, less stable equilibrium, one that's a lot less coherent and a lot less robust. But in the short term, you don't get that shock. So, you know, from my perspective, Trump would actually be good for Europe because he will galvanize action and enable politics to do things it will otherwise not be able to do than if you were to see, you know, effectively a continuation of the status quo with Harris in the White House, because, you know, then I think we will struggle on all of these issues. And I think the binding constraint on von der Leyen will be what's happening in France and Germany. No one's really talking about this, but to my mind, this is the major constraint now on European action for the medium term. It is a very dysfunctional France and a very dysfunctional Germany. And I don't think Europe can work with a dysfunctional France and Germany. I don't at all believe in the thesis that von der Leyen steps into the vacuum and can deliver absent leadership in Germany and France. And I don't believe Central and Eastern Europe can do it without Germany and France. I think ultimately what you need is an enabling environment in France and Germany for Europe to move ahead. And I don't think you have that. And that's a major problem. And I don't think people are talking enough about the extent to which that's a major problem and a major, major break on all of von der Leyen's ambitions in the context of her second mandate. And when you ask officials around von der Leyen about her answer to that question, they don't have an answer because there is no answer. The answer is not a pretty answer. The answer is a bad answer.
Let's maybe turn to France. And actually, just one quick aside. I guess the big challenge for a Harris administration, at least I think, how do you sort of shift U.S. policy to stimulate European integration in a way that doesn't cause, you know, that shock of kind of the NATO withdrawal? And is there a more positive path? I think that's sort of an open question, may not be possible. It may need the actual Trump shock to facilitate that. But in some case, you know, we'll see what happens. But maybe let's turn to France. You, I think, surprised me earlier in this conversation by saying that there might be elections in France in the new year. Maybe you could give us a quick recap of kind of where things stand in French politics. You know, of course, there was the snap election Macron held after the European parliamentary elections in June. That has then created a very messy parliament. How do you see things standing right now politically?
So we're in a kind of tentative peace, I think. We have a minority government. Barnier is the prime minister. The left came first in the elections, but were well short of a majority. They threw up this very obscure Paris town hall official to lead the government. Macron said, no way. Lucie Castet, her name was, she was never going to be the PM. As a result, they now feel completely disenfranchised. And as a result, are opposing everything the Barnier government does. The coalition that has formed is comprised of the centre and the centre-right. And so you're in this very odd equilibrium where if Marine Le Pen decides to combine her votes with that of the hard left, you would have a majority to bring the government down. And so the only question about whether Barnier's government survives or not is what Le Pen decides to do, because the left is annoyed and in opposition to everything Barnier is trying to do, but they don't have the numbers by themselves to bring the administration down. But combined with Le Pen, they do. And so it's all on Le Pen. What will she do? And that's why, it's an odd situation for a number of reasons. Odd because everyone thought the far right would come first and form the government. As it turned out, they came third. But even though they've come third, they're now the veto player in the new regime and can bring Barnier down at any moment. Any second Le Pen changes her mind, the Barnier government will fall and Macron has to go back to the drawing board. So that's a really odd equilibrium and one that people weren't expecting. And secondly, because Barnier and Macron and the relationship between them is very strange. Macron, this is kind of cohabitation where Barnier is now able to do what he wants and Macron is responsible only for domestic policy and EU affairs and foreign affairs. And Barnier is doing all domestic, right? So Macron's doing foreign, Barnier is doing domestic. And so it's meant to be a version of that cohabitation, which is a kind of very uncomfortable arrangement for Macron to be in. I was in Paris a week ago speaking to officials in the Élysée, Matignon, National Assembly, and I was told Macron didn't even have sight of the budget before Barnier announced it, didn't even know what was going to be included in the budget, didn't have good visibility on a lot of the detail, which for a president who believed in verticality and the power of verticality and centralization, where nothing happens without his sign-off, to be in a situation where his legacy is being overturned by virtue of the agenda Barnier is implementing is a totally remarkable situation that demonstrates just how weak Macron is across the board. And, that weakness on domestic policy obviously does have an impact on his agency in Europe and abroad as well. So that's the situation we're in. Now they've implemented or attempting to implement a budget, and the budget is important because it's really about France's credibility in the eyes of capital markets, which is important when you've got a debt level north of 110% of GDP and a deficit above 6% of GDP. Ultimately, they need to continue supporting themselves and they don't want to lose market access. And so what they signal they're doing to market participants is really important, but it's also important for Macron's credibility in Europe. Macron's big idea was back in 2017, I'm going to balance the budget and build credibility in Berlin by running a prudent and sensible fiscal policy. And that's all now been completely undone. And so the refrain from everyone in Brussels to any of Macron's ideas is, well, but look at his own house. It's not in order. And so none of Macron's ideas or initiatives in Europe or anywhere have any credibility on borrowing, on doubling the capacity of the MFF, on Eurobonds, etc., because people say, well, your deficit's 6%. And you've got nothing to say at the European level until your own house is in order. So it's totally undermined his legitimacy and credibility on all major European questions because this perception that the domestic economic situation is a total shit show and the political situation is a total mess. So that's kind of where France is. I think it's bad for Macron. I think, it's not great for Barnier. The situation's a bit more stable. I think the budget goes through because Le Pen doesn't want to pull the plug. If she does, people, I think, will blame her. And I think for now, she doesn't believe chaos and institutional and political disorder are in her interest. But the RN is totally incoherent, hugely opportunistic and hugely tactical. And that calculation may change at any moment. I suspect once the budget is through, assuming she extracts certain concessions that she'll want on things like pension freezes and minimum wage, they'll reconsider what they want to do with the government. And at some point, they may decide it's in their interest to bring the government down and that chaos is better than order. I don't think that's where they are now, but I've got no confidence that's not where they'll be in 6 months. So Macron can't call an early election until next June or July. But from that point, if the government falls, he could call another election. And then the very final thing I'll say is we're really focused on the hard left and the far right, because as I said, structurally, the combination of those votes can bring the government down. But I think it's also fair to say, and one thing I was struck by when I was in Paris a week ago, was the extent to which Macron's own Renaissance MPs are furious with him. They hate him. And the pushback they present towards him for what he has done and the agenda that's now being implemented, in particular the tax increases, which they feel are a complete violation of the supply side reforms they've been advocating for over the last decade, is remarkable. The pushback from the centre-right against Macron and Barnier and what Barnier is trying to do is remarkable. And so I just introduced the final thought, which is the Barnier government may fall not because of the hard left and the far right, but because the minority parties supporting it in the centre and the centre right fragment as well. That's also a weak link, and it's something one also needs to be alive to. And I just wrote a note, Max, for clients on that actually 2 days ago, 1,200 words of analysis saying exactly that the centre and the centre right, as they look to 2027 to challenge the Elysee, may make the determination that, being connected to Barnier and supporting Macron is not in their interest if they want to run in 2027. So you've got a very fragile, very weird, I think, political environment in France now. And I think that's structural. I don't think it's cyclical. I think it's going to be like that for the foreseeable future, thanks to Macron and the gamble he made, which was the wrong gamble. And it's paying him badly now, I think, both domestically and in Europe.
In France, the political system is still reeling from, I would say, 2017. It's not just the gamble that Macron made on this election and then on Barnier, it's also the fact that the boundaries between the center parties were shattered. And it feels to me like they're still all looking for a political identity that is not hinging entirely on the personality of this one man. So there's decisions he's made that obviously they disagree with, but I think I wonder if there might also be resentment with the fact that he has done nothing to build a real movement that's not entirely dependent on him, a succession plan, because if he really cared about that, I think he would have made some slightly different moves over the last few years, including in June. I feel like there's also a search for purpose.
That's where Macron and Johnson, and Macron won't like the analogy or the connection, but that's where the two of them are very similar, right? It's these huge personalities that suck all the oxygen and life out of their political systems, but then do nothing to build the infrastructure and build out those political systems. And they become very dependent. And then, of course, they take these huge gambles, Boris with Brexit, Macron with his election. And what's left in the aftermath of those gambles is a huge amount of damage and a lot of destruction. We've seen it in the UK, and to some extent, I did say that at the time. Macron's early election was France's Brexit moment, because the election didn't end that badly. It could have been a lot worse. If the far right had formed a majority, France would have moved to a debt crisis, and we would have been in a totally different universe. It would have been a completely different world. Think about Greece 10 years ago, but on steroids. Macron bet the house, and, he may not have lost the house, but he lost all of its contents and, the garage and everything else kind of thing. And I think he is a lot weaker now domestically, and he is a lot weaker in Europe. People have moved on, I think, from Macron. Nobody really cares about what he thinks or says anymore. It sounds brutal, but that's the fact and the truth of it. You really get that very distinct impression in Brussels that no one is very interested in what he has to say. And you also get that impression domestically from his own MPs in his own minority government. People aren't really interested or invested in what Macron's got to say. The country's moved on.
And we have 3 years until the next election. I mean, I guess the nightmare scenario would be that you get to a final round of a French presidential election, and it's the kind of far left and far right, and the center has sort of collapsed. A two-part question here. One, is that where sort of France is on track for? Just sort of a really rocky 3 years in which the kind of center is just sort of blamed for everything, in some ways rightly, in some ways wrongly, but that it's sort of left with the two big parties standing on the far right and the far left. And then the final question to sort of close out. I mean, it strikes me that the issues facing both France and Germany, it's sort of a self-imposed economic austerity. In France, it's because of their budget deficits. But that part of what the Draghi report was pointing to is that Europe is part of the solution to the economic stagnation and doldrums. And that, as both countries are trying to figure out a way forward economically, that actually having more integration, whether it's the capital markets union, whether it's more fiscal integration at the European level, is part of the economic solution. And while they're both right now seemingly the obstacle at kind of advances to European integration, do you think that could flip? So first, the doomsday scenario in France, and then maybe to close us out on, is there maybe a sliver of optimism that they'll both sort of discover Europe again?
So on France, I think, look, a lot will really depend on whether the centre can organise itself. The story in France is the far right and the hard left have consolidated and the centre is fragmented. And that's the challenge running into 2027, because how many contenders do you have running in the centre? We have Edouard Philippe, we have Bruno Le Maire, maybe, we have Le Cornu, we have Attal, there may be one or two others. And all of these folks come from different parties. There's no chain of succession from within Renaissance, from Macron to a successor. There's no process, no primary. So how are you going to organize around a candidate to replace and succeed Macron? Macron is not a nurturing personality. He's not the kind of person to pick out someone and say, this is going to be my successor. That's not his nature. And so the judge and jury for the replacement around Macron, of Macron, will be the opinion polls. And that could come very late in the day. So that's the risk. That's that scenario, Max, you talk about, where you don't get united around a candidate. And so you end up by default with the hard left and the far right in a runoff. And then it doesn't really matter. The difference between their programs from an economic perspective doesn't really matter. It's inconsequential. Maybe at the margin, the far right's program is a bit better because what they showed on the campaign is a willingness to moderate. Bardella began to row in a lot of the crazy things, whereas Mélenchon and the LFI just stuck to their plans. It was a massive fiscal expansion and they weren't going to compromise. And so maybe the takeaway from that experience, June, July, was when push comes to shove, the far right will moderate at the margin where the hard left won't. And so probably the overarching preference for market participants and others will probably rather be the far right. But, still, they're both really bad economically. So can the centre organise? That's a massive question. On a slightly more optimistic front, I'd say, Le Pen is still struggling to get 50% plus one. I think she's at like 42 now, 43%. Like, it's not clear where that remaining kind of 8-9% is going to come from. And you did see major mobilization of the Republican front and massive tactical voting. And so structurally, the optimistic argument is she's tried 3 times in 7 years and failed. There is no majority for her in France. And this is her last shot. She probably won't do it. They have a massive HR problem because you saw between round 1 and round 2, all the RN candidates were exposed as, freaks and xenophobes and racists and misogynists, etc. And that was very visible, and it's going to take them a long time to replace all of those candidates. That's a massive HR endeavor, and it's going to, constrain them for the foreseeable. And Bardella wasn't as effective as we thought he would be. He wasn't as effective a spokesperson and rep for the RN as people thought he was going to be. And so actually the challenges for Le Pen and the RN are pretty formidable and maybe even structural. But, there's no conviction around either of those views. And so running into 2027, the tail risk will be either the hard left or the far right delivers a majority, and that will be the concern. And that will now happen in a context where there are major concerns about the economic situation, because even though Barnier is targeting this deficit to get to 5 next year and below, every single year there's been slippage because the forecasts are over optimistic and they simply can't deliver against the targets they're mandating. So there's a really complex and awkward and horrible political and economic situation now. That's something of a vicious circle, and that dynamic runs into 27, and that's a major problem. Can they rediscover Europe? It's hard, I think. I think we've not talked at all about Germany, but the situation there is equally problematic. Germany has a political culture that's bent towards stability, and our odds of the government seeing through its term is 75%, which sounds like a high number, but in context is a very low number. Major questions around whether Lindner wants to exit the coalition, and he believes it may be in his interest to do so once the budget's passed. That may happen, it may not. But the fact it's even being talked about and it's a concern shows you how fragmented and ineffective this coalition has been. Merz, I suspect, will be better in terms of stability on domestic questions around fiscal policy with respect to Russia and Ukraine. He'll be tougher and more hawkish. And he may lean into Europe. And if Merz does interesting things domestically, especially with respect to the debt brake, does that create potential space to do more in Europe? Maybe on the MFF that we've been discussing, maybe on a Eurobond. It won't be obvious or immediate. A lot will depend on who his coalition partner is. If it's the SPD, I suspect more ambition. If you get 3 parties, it becomes complicated. So I think 2 large parties, right and left, are probably a better overall formula than 3 parties with the Greens, and certainly, not with the FDP. But German politics has become a bit irrational and a bit unpredictable, and I think that's a problem. And so at the margin, I think Merz will be good. But does that compensate for, the lack of Macron? He's been such an important change agent in Europe, and he's been such an important promoter and innovator of ideas, constantly pushing against the boundaries, you will all know, on the strategic rethink on NATO for Ukraine, on expedited membership for Ukraine in the EU, kind of NATO troops in the Ukraine theatre, Eurobond for defence, the sovereignty fund, all of these ideas, they're all Macron's. And Merz, I don't think, is going to deliver that. I don't think Edouard Philippe would have the same kind of intellectual prowess and approach towards Europe. And so I think in that vacuum, whoever steps into the vacuum in France, I don't think will be as effective a kind of champion for Europe and a believer in Europe as Macron was. So I don't know. Maybe in the margin over the medium term, a bit more stability in France and Merz in Germany, early 2026. Is there a window potentially to do some interesting things then? Possibly. But certainly not next year. And I'm still probably quite skeptical about the, 26, 27 was a very interesting year. But then obviously, as soon as you get towards the end of 26, we're moving into the French presidential election, which knocks out the ability to do anything meaningful then. So I don't know. We're all quite depressed at the moment when we think about the outlook for the EU. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
it's hard to be positive.
There's a sliver of hope.
You find the positive if you squint and look at it from really far away.
Yes, if Donald Trump wins, I think that's the big takeaway. Then things are looking up in Brussels. Well, on that note, Mitch, it's been great to have you back on the Eurofile. This has been an outstanding conversation. Thanks again, and we hope to have you back sometime soon.
Amazing, guys. Thanks a lot.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producer, Sean Falk, to Otto Svensson and Essi Pekkonen for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.